This is Jared Ngbazo, and you are listening to UC3P.
Welcome to UC3P, our eponymously named podcast on policy, politics, and current affairs. My name is David Raban, and I'm the production manager for what we like to call the main page. Today, we talk with Eric Oliver, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. His research focuses include contemporary American politics, political psychology, and public support for conspiracy theories. We spoke to Professor Oliver about nationalism and populism. Before we get into the interview, I have a couple notes. First, Julian Lake conducted this interview in early 2018, about a year after the inauguration of President Donald Trump. We had initially planned for this interview to be part of an earlier podcast series we called What If? That series didn't continue, but this interview still feels relevant. So for your information, we have edited the interview down so that it makes sense for November 2019. Second, this is the last of our old interviews. Really, that's it. Moving forward, everything on this podcast will be brand new, and we hope you're looking forward to it. Now, without further ado, here's political science professor Eric Oliver.
Hi everyone, this is Julian Lake sitting down today with Dr. Eric Oliver. Oliver is a professor here with us at University of Chicago and an expert in contemporary politics. Professor Oliver, very glad to sit down with you today and talk about nationalism and populism in America.
Sure, thanks. It's nice to be here.
I want to open today with some definitions about nationalism and populism for our listeners who may not know. What is nationalism? What is populism? How are they different? How are they related?
When we think about nationalism, we typically think about people who have a very strong affiliation or attachment to the country in which they're a citizen or which they belong to or which they share some sort of ethnic heritage with. Populism, on the other hand, is a style of political rhetoric. It's not really an ideology. It's more a way of describing systems of power. And it's usually describing the systems of power of thinking about some sort of nefarious elite that has absconded with the rightful sovereignty of the people. This can happen on the political left. It can happen on the political right. It's in some ways orthogonal to ideology. Populism and nationalism are often related because when populist political leaders are invoking the people, they oftentimes describe them in nationalistic terms. The elites are taking the rightful sovereignty away from Americans. And oftentimes they use this nationalism to define the people. The people are defined by the fact that they're not, and this, say in the case of the United States, they're not Mexicans, they're not Europeans, they're not Russians, they're not elites. And then when we measure populism, we find that these factors actually correlate with each other quite strongly. So people who supported Donald Trump and his populist claims, they not only believed that political elites had absconded with the rightful sovereignty, but they also had very strong feelings of nationalism. They were much more likely to say that being an American was very important to who they are. They're much more likely to fly a flag, these types of things.
Okay, fantastic. Some would say that in recent years, nationalism and populism have seen like a recent surge, especially nationalism is very surprising to some people. We've had rallies like the one in Charlottesville, Virginia, some in Washington, D.C., here in the United States, but also around the world. In Poland, there was recently a white nationalist rally that drew 60,000 participants, and we also saw some sort of national sentiments come out during Brexit. So what do you think is driving some of these nationalistic tendencies around the world?
Well, I think it's important to differentiate between nationalism and, in the case of the United States, white nationalism. So nationalism, I think, is a very common characteristic across countries across the world. In the United States, nationalism has been one of the key defining characteristics of American political culture for a long time. Americans are very, very intensely patriotic and very strongly nationalistic compared to other industrialized countries. I think what's changed more recently is this notion of white nationalism, which is, in the case of the United States, people identifying that being American means being white, or being white and Christian, even more particular than this. And you see this also in Europe, where you have nationalist fervor also tying itself to a strong ethnic identity as well. What is causing that? There's a lot of debate over why this is rising. In the United States, clearly the Trump presidency has given encouragement, albeit indirectly, to this white nationalist sentiment through Trump's communications, his tweets, his refusal to disavow David Duke as an example of this. So a lot of white nationalist groups feel themselves emboldened and are taking opportunities to then go and express themselves more publicly. In Europe, I'm not as familiar with why white nationalism is rising. I think it has to do with immigration pressures, with strains within the EU, within the changing nature of the economic system in Europe, sort of the erosion of traditional class divides. And this is probably also contributing this to some extent in the United States as well.
How about populism? You talked about Donald Trump, who's a leader on the right side of American politics, but are we seeing any of this type of nationalistic, or maybe reframed as a more populistic message on the left? There's some more talk these days about fringe groups like Antifa, and some might say that they've seen folks on the left and rhetoric on the left as also giving rise to them. How is that the same, or how is it different?
Sure. In 2016, we surveyed Americans about this, and we were doing comparisons between populist candidates on the right, which were, say, Donald Trump or Ben Carson, and a candidate on the left who got labeled as a populist, which was Bernie Sanders. And the interesting thing was that if you compare supporters of these candidates, they do share one trait in terms of a dimension of populism that's blaming political elites. People on both of these sides think that political elites are corrupt, that they're in the hands of the wealthy, that they're not representing ordinary Americans. What differentiates these groups, though, between the left and the right is that our right-wing populists tend to be a lot more nationalistic. So Bernie Sanders supporters, for example, did not attach a strong nationalist identity to themselves. Being an American was not necessarily important to their sense of self and who they were. Similarly, Sanders supporters are not suspicious of experts across the board. If you ask Trump supporters and right-wing populists, they're typically not only suspicious of political experts, but they're also suspicious of academics, cultural elites, lawyers, economists, scientists, whereas Sanders supporters are not suspicious of these particular groups. And I think in that way, Sanders isn't really a classic populist. He's much more of a socialist, which is how he describes himself. I don't know how that translates to some more fringe leftist groups like Antifa, but as far as vocal political leaders who have large followings, who oftentimes get described as populist, i.e. Bernie Sanders, I don't think the description actually fits him the way it does, say, a Donald Trump or even a Ben Carson.
How do you think that this will change as we move on the international stage in the future? Do you think that this is sort of a fleeting phenomenon, that as we get later into Trump's term, if his unpopularity continues, or if he is voted out of office, do we think that there might be a recession of this nationalist outpouring? Or do we think that this is something that might be here to stay and is continuing to change the landscape of politics in the U.S. and around the world?
In the United States, historically speaking, there have been populist and ethno-nationalist movements that have waxed and waned over time. If you go back and look in history, in the 1830s and 1840s, for example, there was the Know Nothing Party, which was a stridently anti-immigrant party. In the latter 19th century, once again, the sort of emergence of populism and white nationalism arose. So there's reasons to think that there are cycles to this, and these things arise and fall and rise and fall. I think the sources of white nationalism, in terms of the economic insecurity of a lot of white working class Americans, the continued sense of cultural change, the sense of ethnic change within the United States, all of these factors are going to probably continue to fuel at least a constituency that's very amenable to these white nationalist types of claims. depending on what happens in the future, if the United States, for example, enters a disastrous war or has a recession or some other kind of cataclysm, it's hard to imagine that Donald Trump's popularity is going to increase. In fact, it's probably going to decrease quite a bit as a consequence of this. And insofar as his credibility diminishes, the credibility of a leader of this kind of white nationalist rhetoric would presumably also diminish. So we have kind of two forces going on here. On the one hand, there's a latent potentiality for this to be sustained, but as Donald Trump sort of either continues to flounder or if he does poorly, the credibility of that as a political strategy for other types of leaders will probably come into question. But I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon.
So it's here to stay for at least for the time being. What do you think this means for people in day-to-day lives? There's a lot of people who worry about hate crimes and these type of negative impacts on the grassroots level. How severe do you think those are compared to past generations? Do you find the time we're living in especially dangerous for those who may not be quote-unquote as American, namely immigrants or people who maybe are not part of that white nationalist coalition?
I don't think the country has been this divided since the late 1960s and early 1970s, particularly on these kind of racial and ethnic lines. If you look at survey data, for example, people who supported Donald Trump have as negative view as the Black Lives Matter as Clinton voters do towards, say, Nazis. So there is a lot of resentment on the right towards minorities, towards movements, towards racial justice. And that degree of polarization is really striking and not good. How you predict this in terms of, what does this mean for safety, violence, civil schisms? That's hard to predict. Clearly, an environment that is as charged and polarized as the one that we have right now, and which we haven't really seen in about 40 some odd years, should be a big source of concern.
And how should U.S. citizens interpret that? For some may seem to draw alarm. What type of reactions have been effective at uniting the country? What type of steps move past these demonstrations?
I think as long as Donald Trump continues to support and retweet and give solace to white nationalism in the United States, it's going to be very difficult. He is the president of the United States. What it really takes historically are leaders on both sides of the political aisle to come together and unify in condemnation of these types of things. And as long as you have the leader of one political party who is refusing to do this and in fact giving endorsement to white nationalism, it's going to be extremely difficult in the short run.
So leadership definitely matters. Well, I'd just like to thank you, Professor Oliver, for your insight into the subject of populism and nationalism here in America. Thanks you so much for your time. It was a pleasure having you and sitting down for this conversation.
Great, thanks.
And that's a wrap on another episode of UC3P. Credits go to Julian Lake for producing, interviewing, and engineering, and me, David Raban, for producing and editing. By the way, Julian, my man, all of us old school podcasters miss you, and we can't wait for you to come visit. Southside! Our communications director is Thomas Krasnation. Our finance director is Donovan Harvey. Our publisher is Haas Yano. Our intro music is Knockout 2 by Tooby, and our outro music is Yes Yes Y'all by Matt Large. Our cover art was designed by Shirin Raban. If you want to hear more podcasts, check out our website, uc3p.org. And if you want to contact us, our email is theuc3p@gmail.com. Before we go, I did want to mention one more thing. If you enjoyed this episode, then we'd love if you would talk about UC3P with 2 of your friends. That's right, just 2 friends. We hope it's not too big of an ask, and we really appreciate your help in getting out the word. My name is David Raban, and stay tuned. We'll be back next week discussing conservatism with Vox reporter Jane Coaston. Oh no. Stop, please.
Oh man.
Oh,
this
man.
is
Are you having too much fun?
too much fun.
Too
I
much
have
fun.
completely ignoring all the piles of problem sets that I have downstairs
Yeah, well, that's why you came upstairs to hide from the world, right?
to hide from the